Thank you so much for joining us today in the launch event of our newly published dynamic report/map Dispossession in the Naqab. Before we start, I'm just gonna present really briefly who profits, talk a little bit about our work, and then we will move right to our speakers. So welcome. So Who Profits Research Center is a Haifa-based research center dedicated to documenting and exposing the ways in which corporate actors, entire sectors, and commercial activity contribute to enhancing and maintaining the Israeli occupation of Palestinian and Syrian lands. We look at companies and sectors that are involved with the occupation, either through enhancing the settlement enterprise, constructing on occupied land, providing any kinds of services to settlements, and producing in settlements. Secondly, we document and expose companies that enhance the Israeli security apparatus and system of population control, either through services to the army, the military, to the wall and checkpoints, and any kinds of services and arms provided to enhance the Israeli security apparatus. And lastly, we look at involvement in economic exploitation, whether it's the exploitation of the Palestinian captive economy, the exploitation of natural resources, and the exploitation of labor. We operate a database of hundreds of involved companies. We operate an information center. All of it is free and accessible to anybody who would like to reach out to us, ask any question about corporate complicity with the occupation. And we also publish reports ranging from short updates to in-depth report where we look closely at certain sectors or issues regarding the economy of the occupation or the involvement of certain sectors. So this is us. And today we're gonna talk specifically about a report that we published in the end of 2021 in December, and it's a dynamic map where we outline the different and connected mechanisms of dispossession that are currently and will be implemented to uproot Palestinian Bedouins in the Naqab. Today, I don't know, as I assume everybody has been following what has been happening in the Naqab for the past month, and Raya will talk a bit more about projects that are being implemented in the Naqab at the moment, but there has been mobilization against one such project, specifically afforestation happening in an unrecognized village in the Naqab. And today, just today, we saw the establishment during nighttime of a settlement on the lands of another village in the Naqab. And these are some of the mechanisms that are used to dispossess Palestinians in the Naqab, and Raya and Mansour will talk more about it, so I won't take a lot of your time. Just a few things. We will, after Raya and Mansour finish their presentations, you have the opportunity to ask questions. Please do so through the chat. Type your questions in the chat, and I will make sure to pass them along. This event is also streamed live on Facebook, and yeah, I'm gonna present our speakers and then give them the floor. First, I would like to present Dr. Mansour Nasasra, who has joined us today. Thank you. Dr. Mansour is a scholar of international relations and Middle East politics, and a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics at Government at Ben Gurion University in the Naqab. Nasasra has published and written extensively on the Palestinian community in Israel and Jerusalem and the Naqab. So thank you, Mansour, for being with us today. Our second speaker is Raya Sana. Raya is the director of Who Profits and also a researcher with Who Profits. So I'm gonna give you the floor, Raya.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that, Hala, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. I know it's a bit confusing. Mansour was introduced first, and then I'm going to be speaking first, but hey. And thank you, Mansour, for agreeing and being with us today. I'm really looking forward for your insights as always. I'm going to talk a little bit about our interactive map that we launched, as Hala said, in December of last year, the logic behind putting this project together and contextualizing the data that you can find there. The Naqab region, I want to give you a little bit of an introduction about the region and kind of a broad framing of what we're talking about. The Naqab region composes 60% of historic Palestine. It is home to 300,000 Palestinians, Palestinian Bedouins, and around a third of them remain steadfast on their land and live in villages that Israel refuses to recognize, despite existing prior to the Nakba in 1948. Non-recognition is geared towards displacing, the complete displacing and the complete erasure of these villages. To do so, Israel deprives them, the residents of these villages, of services, infrastructure, and implements an aggressive policy of house demolition. And we see how this policy is increasing and getting kind of bolder in recent years. In 2020, for example, there was a 13% increase in demolitions than in 2019. Ongoing systematic processes of displacement and dispossession have led to the de-development of the Palestinian community as a whole and the establishment of dependency on Israel's basic necessities and survival. This process isn't new. Mansour will probably elaborate on this a little bit more. At the end, with the lifting of Israel's military rule in 1966, this process was referred to as forced urbanization, a process that was intimately linked with Israel's strive and strategies of control, but also with Israel's economic need for cheap Palestinian labor. Again, Mansour will probably kind of give insights to this. Today, Palestinians in the Naqab, regardless of the status of their residential area, because there's some that live in kind of areas that Israel deems legal and then areas that Israel deems illegal, regardless of this kind of status, Palestinians in the Naqab in general suffer from chronically high levels of unemployment and poverty rates, the highest amongst Palestinians in Israel. In parallel to this systematic ongoing process of dispossession and displacement and de-development, Israel has been consistently pouring investment for the advancement of what it purports to be developmental projects. And this has increased since the early 2000s. And so historically, in the Naqab and across Palestine as a whole, development project, industrialization projects have been carried out by Israel with the complete disregard of Palestinian communities at the expense and at the direct expense of Palestinian communities in the Naqab, as well as we see kind of across the West Bank and in other areas. So in the Naqab, you see these images of kind of electricity plants and industrial areas and so on, and around them the scattered Palestinian Bedouin communities breathing in these toxic waste or being deprived of electricity, even if electricity lines are passing through them and over their heads. And since the process accelerated into early 2000, and the framework for this acceleration was the passing of what Israel called a comprehensive national strategic plan for the development of the Naqab. And this particular plan had two imperatives that worked hand in hand and worked in parallel. On the one hand, the attempt and the strive and the aim to Judaize the Naqab. What does this mean? As elsewhere in Palestine, it is increasing the presence of Jewish Israeli population in that particular area. To put this in context, the Naqab is around 60% of the land, but only around 8% of Israeli Jews live in the Naqab. And the second is to concentrate the Palestinian Bedouin population on a smaller amount of land as possible. The presence of Palestinians on different areas in the Naqab and the lack of concentration for Israel is formed as a way as presented as a way of lack of sovereignty, of ungovernmentality that is kind of in the Naqab and so on. And so these two processes are working in parallel, and since then, really, we've seen huge amounts of resolutions and policies being passed, and millions and billions of shekels being invested for this purpose, in the purpose of a national development project in the Naqab. And framing what is happening in the Naqab as a process of national development is not new in colonial terminologies for this particular project, but it has also slightly shifted the means and the ways in which Palestinians are being uprooted and displaced from their land. You probably, if you've been paying attention to what is going on and been following the Naqab and Palestine more generally for a while, you'd probably remember 2013, when Israel tried to pass the Brouwer-Begin bill, which essentially was a bill to completely and at the same time erase the 35 unrecognized villages in the Naqab. Mass popular mobilizations locally and internationally stopped this process. And so the advancement of these so-called national economical projects was a means to work towards both of the objectives that I talked about at the beginning, right? So displacement would become localized and fragmented, so it wouldn't be mass, all of it at the same time. It would be around specific projects affecting particular communities at different times, at different scales. And the Naqab would develop economically to lure and to incentivize the movement of Israeli Jews particularly from the center of Israel, where it's the dense population is there, to populate the region. And this kind of synergy between development and dispossession in the Israeli context was succinctly articulated by Yuri Ariel, who was the Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development, that has a very significant role in the Naqab, and maybe Mansour can elaborate a little bit more on this, or we can talk about this in the Q&A. And then was also head of the Bedouin Authority. He said in 2019 that these national development projects pose a golden opportunity to move the Naqab forward, to settle a significant part of the scattered Bedouin population once and for all, and to restore the state vast areas that were taken illegally. The implementation of this political strategy is, as we know, similar to other political strategies by Israel, are carried out, facilitated, and made possible through the involvement of private companies. So the afforestation projects that that Hala spoke about and that we've seen highlighted in the news is part of a broader kind of a greenwashing strategy in the Naqab, greenwashing the occupation more generally, but also part of broader projects that are being implemented in the Naqab at this moment in time. And this afforestation project is actually quite, afforestation has been used, is used, and the role of the Jewish National Fund is very clear and stark in the kind of processes of dispossession in Palestine as a whole. But this project is quite huge, and it's not really clear where it starts and where it ends. So when we were developing the map, we wanted to include the afforestation project because we've known about these projects for a while. But it was very hard for us to assess and to ascertain accurate data of where these projects are exactly going to be implemented, how much exactly they are, where do they move from, where do they stretch from, and so on. We're still thinking this through, and probably and hopefully we'll be adding this to the map in the near future as things become a little bit clearer. But also, if you're driving through the Naqab, you see huge amounts of transport infrastructure being developed, roads, railways. And of course, we know that transport infrastructure is essential for the movement of people. It is essential for the movement of capital. It is an indicament of different projects that will be developed in the region and in that area in the future. Legislation has also been expanded to facilitate the expansions of quarries and the plunder of Palestinian natural resources in the Naqab. So we see, for example, I'm going to share with you here a little bit the map so you can see how these projects are also marked on the map itself. So this is the map that I am talking about, and I probably should have shared this before, but here we go. So this is kind of the map that lays out the different projects, and in every project you can enter into these projects and understand a little bit more about these projects, and also the corporate companies that are and the companies that are involved in these projects. And so there have been industrial projects that have been advanced, as I said, in transport infrastructure projects that are being advanced, and interestingly also in the contracts and the tenders that are being published for these projects, some of them directly say that in order for you to win this contract, you will also have to pave a road. The road will be paved from one area to another, and this will and that that road is clearly passing on a Palestinian Bedouin village in the area. So private companies are being bought in to do the work that the Israeli government has been trying to do since the Naqba in 1948 of uprooting Palestinians from their land. There's massive projects of urban expansion, building new residential areas, building new towns, often on the remains and of Palestinian Bedouin villages like Hiran, for example, that is going to be built and developed on the remains of Hiran that was displaced not too long ago. Importantly, also, there's a huge investment and huge incentives are being poured to develop the city of Bir al-Saba. Bir al-Saba is the kind of the historical Palestinian city in the Naqab. It is the biggest city at the moment, and there is an attempt to kind of build it as a tech hub, particularly for cyber technology. And this has been going on for years. In 2014, then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that he wanted to turn the city of Beersheba into the center, the cyber center of the Western Hemisphere. And interesting kind of incentives and interesting Israeli governmental policy has been passed to facilitate this. For example, the Israeli government has agreed to subsidize some of the salaries of tech workers in companies that set themselves and establish themselves in the city of Beersheba. In a way, kind of this whole thing of trying to develop Beersheba as a tech hub and to lure kind of Israelis to come into the city, to live in it, to live in the areas around it, is a little bit reminiscent of the kind of the Zionist pioneers, of the Zionist pioneers who were implanted in the Naqab, to set up kibbutzim and agricultural farms. And an additional kind of central pillar of this kind of whole process of development come dispossession is the expansion of military facilities in the Naqab. The Naqab is already highly militarized. Huge amounts of the land in the Naqab are designated as military zones. Maybe you could associate it with the Jordan Valley, Area C, and so on. A lot of these unrecognized villages are also in military zones, themselves, or in adjunct to them, around them, etc. But the further expansion of the military industry in the Naqab is seen as also a means and a way of creating jobs and high-ranking jobs in the area. Again, an economic and a financial incentives to lure people into the Naqab. For example, the selling of IMI, the Israeli military company, the massive Israeli military company, to Elbit Systems, was conditioned on Elbit actually moving IMI facilities from the center of Israel into Ramat Beka industrial zone here, into this area and expanding this zone even further. Elbit System is contracting other companies to build this facility, of course, and so on. And I guess, so the scale of the Naqab as an area, but also the scale of these different projects that are taking place, and how they are directly facilitating the forced displacement of Palestinian communities, how they're also geared to strangle and to limit the development of existing legal kind of residential areas, the different forms of these projects, the different times in which these particular project is accelerated, and so on. This all is kind of meant to create a sense of confusion and fragmentation and disconnectivity between one kind of an incident of displacement and another. And I think we did this map in an attempt to kind of paint this bigger picture, in an attempt to fight against this strategy of fragmentation, to enable us to see how these projects all connect together and build together towards the implementation of political imperative of displacement and uprooting Palestinians from their land. And these projects that we have at the moment, they're the major ones that are now on the table, but there are other ones that are being planned. There are other ones that we know of. Some of them we've already done work on that we will be consistently adding to this map. And we hope that putting these projects all together on a map can help us all collectively understand how all of these processes are linked together, but also form a tool for us to understand the methods and strategies that Israel is constantly developing for Palestinian dispossession, and how private companies are intrinsically linked to these processes. So we hope that this map is useful for you to situate various stuff that are happening at the moment, but it also forms a tool for kind of for advocacy and learning and so on. And so I'm going to stop there, and I know that I've that I talked a little bit for too long, but I'll give the floor to Mansour and we'll come back in the Q&A. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Rhea. Just before we move to Mansour, I'm gonna add the links to the map and the link to our website where you can also reach the map from there to the chat. So anyone who's interested in going and seeing the map, please do so. Yeah, Mansour, the floor is yours.
Oh, okay. Thank you. طيب, شكرا. Thank you, Hala, and thank you, Raya. Can you hear me? Everything's okay? Yeah? Hala?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thanks very much for the invitation. Thanks, Hala, and thanks, Raya, again. Thanks for your insights. And good evening to all our participants. And I'm glad to be here with this important project that Raya has discussed, and obviously it also contributes to the ongoing knowledge production about the situation in the Naqab and the whole story of the Palestinian dispossession in the Naqab. So what I'm going to do briefly is try to contextualize the story of the southern part of Palestine, which is called the Naqab and Be'er Saba region today, in historical terms, and discuss a few examples based on my recent book, The Naqab Bedouin, A Century of Politics and Resistance. And I will try to see basically the different stages of dispossession and how the impact of those expulsion activities toward the Palestinian communities in the Naqab and the outcome of those policies as we see these days. So as I mentioned, I will basically elaborate on some of my recent book chapters and try to link it to the historical context of basically of this area that's called the frontiers of empire. So I think that what I always mentioned in my different conversations and talks about this region, this is a very central area, which is called the southern part of Palestine, the Beersheba district, which is considered to be the frontiers of empire, the frontiers of the Ottoman Empire, the frontiers of the British Empire, and also the frontiers of the Israeli state today. And it's very strategic area that is linked to an important cities like Gaza and Hebron, as well as to the Mutasarrifiyya of Jerusalem. And this area is also linked to Sinai, as well as Transjordan historically, which basically links us to Europe and Africa, which basically tells the story of how important and strategic this area and why the ongoing Israeli policies today to displace the community and try to control them in restricted zones is still ongoing even from the late Ottoman rule. So what I always mention about this region is the centrality of the most beautiful city here of Beersheba, which is the capital city, as we call it, of southern Palestine, and the most important city of Beersheba that is linked to Gaza and to Hebron, as well as to Jerusalem, which is the frontier city. Which obviously this city that is located in the south is the most important Palestinian city in this southern region, and is very much linked to basically different cities in the region, including Majd al-Asqalan, as well as Isdud, as well as Hebron and Jerusalem, and as I mentioned, which basically tells the geopolitical location of this region and the links to the Palestinian cities and villages in the region. And I think that's also tells the story of the centrality of this city that we can see until today. If you ever visited Beersheba, the old city, you can still see the signs of the Ottoman Empire in the city, as well as the signs of the historical Palestinian buildings that still exist in the city of Beersheba, which tells how important this city was during the Ottoman times, the British rule, as well as the expulsion of those Palestinian communities from the city of Beersheba until after even the Naqab of 1948, which continued even until 1967. But if you visit the city, you can see always the Palestinian houses, the architecture, and the importance of this city that brought, in fact, merchants from Gaza, from Hebron, and from Jerusalem, and from the urban communities in the south to come and live in Beersheba and populate this area. And lots of those kind of historical sites, from cemeteries, even the symbols of empire, like Allenby here monument, it still exists in the city, which basically tells that the struggle, even today, under the Israeli rule, is about the centrality of the city and the importance of the city, which I call the frontier city of Beersheba. This city basically was linked to different communities, including Jerusalem by the train station and the railway system that links Beersheba to Jerusalem, to Jaffa, to Haifa, and even you can cross the border to different parts of the Middle East, and it's very central in terms of the location as well as the networking to Jerusalem. I would elaborate a bit on the issue of what is the conflict about. If we talk about a Palestinian community in the Naqab and in Beersheba in particular, we talk always about land ownership. We talk about a city that has been run by the local Bedouin, Palestinian Bedouin communities. And also we mentioned always important factors about land ownership that, based on archival research that we have conducted in the land registry records in Istanbul and Ankara and even in London, we always bring evidences about land ownership issues in Beersheba and the registration of land, in fact, and payment of taxes and cultivated land, barley, wheat industry that has used to be exported through the port of Gaza. It's quite significant, which basically rejects the whole idea of the Israeli paradigm that the people didn't register their land and they didn't pay taxes to the government even during the Ottoman and the British rule. However, our records from the archives in Istanbul, as well as Ankara and London, brings lots of important data, as you can see here, about land registrations in this region, as well as even clashes with Istanbul in terms of the land ownership issues that we can see here in the Ottoman documents, even going back to 1913, which is an important aspect to tell the story of how the Israeli paradigms basically portray the whole story of landless communities, nomadic communities that they have no attachment to the land. However, the story from the archival records in the West, as well as from oral history that we conducted in recent years, tells a different story about this region and about this city. And this is important geopolitically. This is one of the most detailed maps you can ever think about, which basically tells the story of southern Palestine that was populated entirely by local Arab Bedouin communities. And this is the map from 1881, which is the Palestine exploration map, which is basically tells the story of the entire region of the Naqab, which is the Beersheba district, has been populated by local Arab Palestinian communities. And even if when we zoom into this map, we can see even the borders between the different families and different tribes and the ownership of the communities, which basically tells the story of the geopolitics, strategic area, as well as the ownership of the local Bedouin communities. I think that's an important factor geopolitically. Geopolitically, we talk about also, as I mentioned earlier, in fact, the networking between Beersheba, Majd al-Asqalan, Fallujah, as well as Gaza, is another important story, which basically brings Beersheba and this region to the whole Palestinian narrative, which is not a kind of a disconnected city from the entire Palestine. But this is the story that always the Israelis brings to us, that this is a kind of a disconnect community. It's a nomadic community that is disconnected from the entire Palestinian community. However, that's the old colonial policies that even the British used in order to fragment this community from the rest of the Palestinian communities, and also link them to other Bedouin communities like Transjordan. Just an example, we can see how important this area became during in fact, the First World War and the Second World War, where the British had to fight and the Ottomans had to fight hard in order to preserve this region. And we can see even evidences from the empire itself. Winston Churchill in 1921 visiting Beersheba and even meeting the tribal communities here, or the leadership of the Beersheba community, and even recognizing their land ownership according to their customary laws and traditions. And this is another important factor from an interview I had conducted with Lord Oxford, who was the British District Commissioner of Beersheba in 1943. And this interview was conducted in Somerset in the UK in 2009 as part of my my PhD project then. And basically we can see even the recognition of the British for this system, as well as the importance of the recognition of this system, the tribal system, as well as in fact the customary laws and the indigenous laws, basically, which basically clashes with the whole Israeli narratives. There is no system that existed in this region. However, we can see even British records, and even from the interviews that I conducted here in the UK, to tell a different story. This brings me to the core aspect of the presentation. Why the Naqab? Why the Negev? Why the southern part of Palestine? For the Jewish national project or for the Zionist project? It's an important aspect geopolitically, as I mentioned, the links to Europe, the links to Africa, and the links to the frontiers, to the Gaza region, to the Sinai region. It has been mentioned already in the 1940s by the Jewish Chronicle, as you can see here, the Negev now or never, which basically has been categorized as an empty territory in Palestine, how the Jewish Zionist project perceived this area as an empty territory. As Raya mentioned, this area is considered to be 60% of historic Palestine, which is a significant component of the territory. However, we can see that even the British themselves, the Conservative Party, have supported the Zionist project to colonize this region. In fact, we can see the concept of colonization has been used in the Jewish Chronicle in order to control this region. And we can see up to 1946 how many Jewish colonies, they were called colonies, Jewish colonies, were basically referred to the Jewish settlements that were created in the Naqab. And this is what's going on even until today. The Israeli policies trying to build more Jewish settlements in the Naqab, as we see. I think Hala mentioned this morning. There's an effort by the Israeli right-wing groups to build a settlement near the Arab town of Rahat, which basically tells the story that this is an ongoing project. This is an ongoing colonization project that has started even in the 1940s. However, the story of dispossession is important and significant. The title of this event is basically what happened in 1948. Most of the Palestinian communities of the Naqab were expelled to Jordan. You can see even they still live in refugee camps until today. in Jordan, and the other part were expelled to Gaza, which is the big kind of prison on earth. And most of the population of this area of Gaza are basically refugees from the Beersheba region. Out of 95,000 people before the Naqba, only 13,000 people have managed to stay on their territory, and then they were subject to a military rule. And I think for me this is the significant component of the Israeli control over this community that still play a role in the Naqab until today. Why? Mostly because in this time frame of 1948-1967, as Raya mentioned, the military rule, most of the land of the community has been confiscated by the Israeli military laws, as well as transferring communities from time to time, as well as using the absentees property laws to control the land of the people in this area. As well as military regulations that prevented people from going back to their land, as well as using, as you see here, military permits that people have to get military permit to move from one place to another, which tells the whole story of dispossession and expulsion during the military rule. I think this era have basically designed the whole structure or the whole component of the conflict today, because most of the land of the community were basically confiscated during the military rule, as you can see the map here, and more and more people were expelled during the military rule, and that is an important component. Until 1959, there were people who were dispossessed from their land, and they were kicked out from their land even into Jordan. And that time, 1959, the village of Lakiya, the entire village were basically expelled to Jordan. 1967 borders. Beyond that, as well as 1959, the case of the Azazma tribes in the Jordanian frontier, where basically, or the Egyptian frontier, were basically expelled outside the borders. And those are based on the Royal Jordanian Embassy in London reports. And there are many reports like that. But mostly what we have seen during this military rule, despite the expulsion activities, is the border economy and the survival mechanism. And what I mean by border economy, during this time frame from 1948 to 1946 or 60, until 1967, basically people have survived in the daily basis by interacting with the West Bank, which is under Jordanian rule, as well as with Sinai and Egypt, as well as Gaza, in terms of their everyday life, in terms of basically buying and selling food via Jordan and Sinai. And those were very harsh military, in fact, regulations that prevented people from interacting with the outside world. And this has basically meant to the local Arab Bedouin communities in this area that they have to cross the border, in fact, in order to survive every day, either getting to Gaza, trying to maintain their family relations, as well as family relations with Jordan, as well as their daily economic relations. This has, in fact, after the end of the military rule, has created the whole idea of the unrecognized villages that you can see here in the map. There are 37 considered to be unrecognized villages that I think they are they were created as a result of the military regulations that prevented people from going back to their land in the western part of the Naqab or the northern part of the Naqab. Okay, so this is why most of those villages have been created during the military rule, and then the situation has been going since then, and people are living there since the 1950s and the 1960s. Some of those villages even existed before 1948. However, most of those villages are historical villages that we can see on the Ottoman records, in the British records. However, they live basically, or they populate the area of the eastern part of Beersheba, which is the military rule zone. However, most of those communities are considered to be even internally displaced people that were kicked out from the western part of the Naqab, the northern part of the Naqab, and they have faced expulsion activities from time to time, And we have seen this a campaign of bravery and the everyday resistance. I've written on this an important paper if you'd like to see later on, but also the role of the growing role of the youth communities is very important. The way those youth and young generation that are resisting the Israeli policies in every day. And for example, in the recent uprisings of the Sawa region, as we see here, those historical villages, most of the people who were arrested basically were teenagers and children from even varying from 10-year-old until basically 15 or 17-year-old, which basically tells the story of how this young generation is trying to face those expulsion activities. And we can see this on the Sawa case, as well as the villages east of Beersheba. Those are many villages like Al-Gharra, as well as Kharbat al-Watan and Ruwais. Those villages that are located in the east of Beersheba, and geopolitically, those are significant villages that basically links Beersheba, in fact, to the area of the international airport of Nevatim, Tel El-Milh airport, as Raya mentioned, in terms of the military importance of this area, which I think is a significant component of the story of the struggle here. And you can see the villages are scattered all over the region, from Beersheba to the international airport of Nevatim, and the civil demonstrations or the everyday demonstrations against the Israeli efforts of dispossession those communities from their land, and then many other stories of in this area. In fact, as you can see, the Israeli policies of demolishing the crops, the most important basis for their life, and that's what happens here when the crops basically are ready to harvest. The Israeli tractors can basically and demolish those crops, and that tells the story, as Raya mentioned. The economy of this community is the most marginalized economy, the most weak economy, and also the most informal economy. That it's not, in fact, a registered economy, but you can see, despite that this is the most poor community or Palestinian community inside Israel, the Israelis are pushing them to the margin of the state in the everyday basis, in terms of demolishing their crops, the wheat and barley, as an important component for their economy, are under danger from day to day. And in fact, the whole story of planting trees instead of those villages, the villages around the area, is part of the ongoing Israeli policies of controlling the space of the Naqab, and which tells the story also of the Israeli or the Zionist policies of controlling land using cultivation or using trees as a mechanism, which is in fact the story in Sheikh Jarrah, the story in East Jerusalem, and the story in the West Bank. The way that those mechanisms of planting trees became a key strategy of controlling the land of the dispossessed communities, not only in the Naqab, but also in many other Palestinian contexts. So I would summarize by saying that the ongoing struggle in the Naqab is about land ownership, is about recognition of the local Arab villages. It's about also the cultivation process. Is about the economy of the communities, the most poor communities that still struggling to survive in different formats. However, on the other hand, the Israeli policies are clear in terms of the continued marginalization of those communities. Despite that, there's a huge effort of the people themselves, in fact, to work hard and improve their life in different forms. However, the settler colonial Israeli policies are continuing basically in the daily basis. On the other hand, the people are steadfast. They are resisting the Israeli policies of demolishing their crops, demolishing even their villages like Al-Araqib and Atir bin Hiran, and even further in Khan al-Ahmar case. Those are just examples to tell that the Israeli policies of dispossession are continued from the military rule until today. However, they are taking different forms today in terms of demolishing the crops, and the cases of the recent case of Sawa just tells the story of how the military rule is still functioning in the Naqab, in fact. Okay, and I'll stop here.